In 1980, a toy company walked into a war it had no business winning, and nearly did. Mattel had spent 30 years making Barbie dolls and Hot Wheels cars. It knew nothing about microprocessors, console architecture, or the cutthroat world of video game retail. What it had was a product that looked, on a television screen, side by side, genuinely better than the most popular console on Earth. The Intellivision wasn't the first system to challenge Atari, but it was the first to pose a serious threat to Atari's dominance. By 1982, Mattel had captured 20% of the billion-dollar American gaming market. 110 programmers worked in secret, their real names kept hidden from the public, building games no one knew they were making. Then, 1983 arrived. Like Atari before it, Mattel found out the hard way that momentum in this industry can reverse faster than anyone believes possible. Mattel wasn't looking to build an empire. It was looking to protect its toy sales. Mattel Electronics was established as a subsidiary of the parent toy company in 1977, formed specifically to develop electronic games, a category that was eating into traditional toy revenue at a pace that alarmed the entire industry. The Atari 2600 had just launched. If consumers were spending their Christmas budgets on game cartridges instead of action figures, Mattel needed to be in that room. Development on what would become the Intellivision began in 1977, the same year the Atari 2600 launched. The main name itself was a portmanteau, Intelligent Television. The ambition was built into the branding from the start. The console was test marketed in Fresno, California in 1979 with 4 games available, then released nationwide in 1980 at $2.99 with a pack-in game, Las Vegas Poker and Blackjack. That price was steep. Atari's 2600 retailed lower, but Mattel was betting that consumers would pay more for something visibly superior. The bet paid off immediately. To protect its programmers from being poached by rival Atari, Mattel kept their identities and work location a closely guarded secret. In public, the development team was referred to collectively as the Blue Sky Rangers. 5 people at the start, eventually 110. Building games in an undisclosed location, their names unknown to anyone outside the company walls. It was the kind of competitive paranoia that only makes sense if the product is genuinely worth protecting. And this one was. The marketing campaign was like anything the gaming industry had ever seen. Mattel produced a series of advertisements featuring George Plimpton that demonstrated the Intellivision's graphics and sound superiority to the Atari 2600 through direct side-by-side game comparisons. Plimpton, journalist, author, editor of the Paris Review, was the last person anyone expected to see pitching a video game console. But that was precisely the point. His presence offered a promise that games could be something other than the detrimental influence many believe them to be. If George Plimpton enjoyed your baseball game, maybe it wasn't rotting children's brains after all. The comparison ads were brutal to Atari. The graphics gap was real and visible, and Mattel made sure every living room in America saw it. By 1981, Mattel Electronics had close to 20% of the domestic video game market, selling more than 3.75 million consoles and 20 million cartridges through 1983. The Blue Sky Rangers were doing something unusual for the era. Instead of licensing as many brands as possible, they focused on building original, technically ambitious games. Don Daglow, director of Intellivision game development, created Utopia, a precursor to the entire sim genre. And with Eddie Dombrower, the groundbreaking sports simulation World Series Major League Baseball. By October 1982, Mattel Electronics had posted a nearly $100 million profit on nearly $500 million in sales, a threefold increase over the previous year. A toy company had walked into a war and taken a fifth of the battlefield. The same report that announced these record profits also predicted losses for the upcoming quarter. Mattel had gotten ambitious, and the video game business of the early 1980s, without perfect execution, was a death sentence. The company had promised something it couldn't deliver, a keyboard component that would turn the Intellivision into a home computer. Consumers were shown the accessory in commercials. They waited. The keyboard component was delayed repeatedly for years. The FTC eventually fined Mattel for misleading advertising. Mattel promised both an upgraded Intellivision 3 and the Intellivision 4 to compete against the ColecoVision, then killed the Intellivision 3 in mid-1983, done in by delays and a market that saw it as too little, too late. Meanwhile, the crash hit. By mid-1983, a glut of video game hardware and software created massive losses and panic across the entire industry. Mattel Electronics cut the price of the Intellivision 2 console to $69, canceled all new hardware development, and laid off hundreds of employees, including 2/3 of the programming staff. By October 1983, losses were over $280 million for the year. Another third of the programming staff was gone by November. And then on January 20, 1984, the remaining programmers were laid off. On February 4th, 1984, Mattel sold the Intellivision business. Mattel Electronics had lost $300 million in 1983 and laid off over 1,000 employees. The buyer was Terry Valesky, Mattel Electronics' former senior vice president of marketing and sales. He formed INTV Corporation, kept the brand alive on a skeleton crew, and sold Intellivision consoles by mail order through the end of the decade. INTV contracted with former Mattel Electronics programmers to complete unfinished games, update old ones, and create new titles. Although cartridge sales were only in the 10,000 to 20,000 range, by running a bare-bones operation, INTV Corp was profitable. The console that had once threatened Atari's dominance was now a mail-order curiosity. But it survived, quietly, stubbornly, right up until 1990, when INTV finally closed its doors. What killed Mattel Electronics wasn't a single bad decision. It was the same thing that killed Atari, a market that collapsed faster than anyone anticipated, combined with a hardware pipeline that cost money to develop and stopped generating revenue overnight. The keyboard component saga stretched resources. The Intellivision 3 cancellation damaged consumer confidence. And when the crash came, there was no buffer. A $100 million profit in 1982, a $300 million loss in 1983. That's not a slow decline. That's a trapdoor. The Blue Sky Rangers didn't disappear. Don Daglow and Eddie Dombrower went to Electronic Arts, where they created Earl Weaver Baseball. Daglow later founded Stormfront Studios. Bill Fisher, Steve Roney, and Mike Breen founded Quicksilver Software. Dave Warhol founded Real-Time Associates. The names that built the Intellivision's library scattered across the industry, taking the skills they developed in secret with them. That's the pattern. Companies die, people don't. The Blue Sky Rangers built some of the most technically sophisticated games in the early 1980s produced, and the industry that emerged from the crash was staffed, in part, by them. Watch for those names as the series continues. Mattel Electronics closed in 1984 in January. 2 months later, a company in Kyoto shipped a console called the Famicom to retailers across Japan.